So we welcome members of the gallery as well and those who might be listening online. If I can remind you that because this is a public evidence session, we are subject to rules around sub judice. So if I could ask you not to refer to live cases that are in front of the court in a way which would be inappropriate, I'd be very grateful around that. As you know, the Women and Equalities Select Committee is undertaking an important inquiry into abortion in Northern Ireland as a result of the CEDAW report, and with our responsibility being to scrutinise the UK government on its adherence to international agreements, and also to give the people of Northern Ireland the opportunity to have their voices heard. This is an important part of that process, so again, thank you for being here, and we look forward to a productive session. We'll be finishing just before 3 o'clock. We are very short on time, so if I could ask you to be mindful of that in your responses. As usual, we're going to ask members to ask a series of questions, but before we do that, could I just ask you to give your name and your title? Amanda.
Amanda Patterson. I'm the Head of Criminal Policy Unit in the Department of Justice.
Michael McBride, Chief Medical Officer for Northern Ireland.
Alistair McInnes, Abortion Policy in the Department of Health, Northern Ireland.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. And Jess is going to start with the questions.
Hello. So whose responsibility is it to address the violations of human rights that the Supreme Court and CEDAW Committee have identified in the current law? I'll start with Amanda.
Well, at the minute, there would certainly have been a responsibility on the Assembly to look at that if there had been a declaration of incompatibility, which there isn't as yet. But at the minute, I'm afraid that the Department of Justice is not able to do anything, given that we don't have a Justice Minister, we don't have an executive, and we don't have an Assembly.
So in light of that, whose responsibility is it?
Well, I can't really give you an answer on that. All I can tell you is that the Department of Justice is no longer able to do anything without the guidance and direction of a minister.
In normal times, it would be the Department for Justice, and currently it is a vacant position.
The position of the Department of Justice at the minute remains as it was more or less 2 years ago when we last had policy guidance from a minister. And the position remains that we have to stay with that policy, which was to we were a part of the interdepartmental group that looked at fetal abnormality, and the policy at that point was a recommendation that the law should be changed, but nothing has happened since then.
Michael.
Well, it's obviously not within my professional remit to advise on legal matters, and I'm not in a position to do that. But I think it's fair to say that we are in somewhat, to quote a term often used, in somewhat uncharted territory. As I say, in the absence of an executive and in the absence of respective ministers, it does leave us in a somewhat challenging position in terms of what options are available should there be such a determination.
Amanda has already referred to the working group. So for what that working group recommended, the change on the law in fetal abnormality, so that was recommended in times when the Assembly was in session. So is it a case that it needs ratifying again? That why can't that continue now?
Well, the working group, as you say, was established in July of 2016. It made its recommendations to then the Department of Health and Department of Justice ministers in October 2016. It did recommend a change in the law in relation to women who were diagnosed with a pregnancy with a fetal abnormality. With the fall of the executive, no progress was made in relation to that then recommendation to ministers.
Are there any other instances, and I understand that you can, each of you, and Alistair obviously wants to hear from you as well, are there any other instances where there were similar working groups where the recommendations have fallen in the lack of the Assembly? I understand that you can only answer from within your, the remit of your own departments.
I'm sure there are.
Where something has been taken. I mean, that is on us to go and look at that. But do you know of any where there was a working group decision made that has, since the Assembly has not been sitting, been taken forward?
I don't know.
Can I ask just in clarifications, is this in relation to this particular area?
No. Towards anything, as a general principle.
I'm not aware of any, but I mean, there may well be some.
Okay. Oh, well, we could look into that.
There are clearly issues in relation to new policy, legislation, which we would wish to take forward in terms of policy, which strategies, which again I gave evidence to the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee fairly recently in relation to that, which we obviously have limitations. We are not ministers, but we will look at the Executive Formation and Functions Act, which has recently been passed, and the extant guidance that we will receive in terms of those powers that we have to progress those areas which we have not been able to progress in the absence of ministers.
So, Alistair, just finally, if the change in the law that was recommended by the working group is to come into practice, does it need a vote in the Assembly?
It would need legislation and the Assembly agreement, yes.
Okay.
But are there any aspects of those recommendations that don't require legislation? Your answer intimated that there might be, Michael.
Yeah, well, certainly I think it was in the latter section, section 5 of that working group report. It did recommend steps that we could take, that could be taken in relation to improving the information and support for women who find themselves in this very difficult set of circumstances. Again, that was contained within the report to and advice to ministers. So
that's
I think
non-legislative.
It's not legislative, but again, there are aspects of that which, as you'll be aware, that the issue of termination of pregnancy in Northern Ireland is extremely contentious. It is probably within the confines of the ministerial code is cross-cutting. It's high profile and controversial, and therefore, in all likelihood, would require executive consideration, if not executive approval. And I would be. I would, again, not for me to advise on legal matters, but I would anticipate that the advice would be that it would require at least consideration by the executive, at least to note.
Is that specifically because it's about abortion? So let's say there'd been a dental working group and there'd been recommendations that are non-legislative about changes in practice to the way that children go to the dentist, for example. Do you think that that's more likely to go through while there isn't an executive?
I mean, I know the general point that you're making. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's a reasonable comparison, if I might say so respectfully. But I think that in those circumstances, were it of a matter which was not as controversial or high profile, then I think that work would be progressed.
So it is the controversy of the issue that stops progress?
I think the issue, the matter is one that is high profile, it is contentious, and is most probably covered, I would anticipate, by the ministerial code, but others may have a...
Amanda, from the point of view of a health perspective, you think that controversy potentially stands in the way of... Would you allow controversy in other areas to stand in the way of health provision?
Well, I can't answer you on health provision at
Alistair
all.
might be.
Alistair, sorry.
I suppose what I was thinking is this is an area where there isn't a very clear, agreed position from the Assembly. If there was unanimity across the Assembly, then we might look at the Executive Functions Act and think about going forward, but we don't have that.
Okay,
we don't have a clear steer. As officials, we don't. And as I say, we cannot anticipate what incoming or future ministers may determine in this matter.
Okay, Vicky.
Thank you. We've received evidence from the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists that the 2013 circular to healthcare professionals left them, and I quote, feeling vulnerable in relation to providing abortion in cases where there is a serious risk to the mental health of the mother. They're concerned about what constitutes a real and serious risk, and they no longer have confidence to practice as before. Do you accept that that's the view of the frontline professionals? And do you think it's clear to health professionals exactly what the circumstances are in which they can perform an abortion within the law in Northern Ireland?
I mean, I've heard those views. I respect and understand those concerns in relation to the 2013 guidance. The 2013 guidance was superseded by the March 2016 guidance, which I think provided much more balanced advice to clinicians in terms of those limited, although be it limited circumstances, where termination of pregnancy in Northern Ireland was lawful. So I think that... as I say, we have moved beyond the 2013 guidelines. They were a product, and indeed they were approved by the executive at that time, and they were consulted upon.
I think we need to make that point. The 2013 was a draft guidance. It was consulted on. It was never issued. It should not have been acted upon. The 2016 guidance was a direct descendant following the consultation responses and reacted to what was said about the 2013 consultation.
So you don't think it's right to say that doctors no longer have the confidence to practice as before? You think that's an incorrect statement, that's inaccurate?
I don't doubt that those were the views that were expressed. I mean, I think the fundamental issue here is perhaps that's more relevant is the issue and findings in terms of our fatal fetal abnormality working group and the views of the RCOG which were expressed at that, where doctors expressed the view that in their professional opinion they were unable to fulfil their duty of care in terms of women in this very challenging circumstances. Now, for a professional to relay to myself as Chief Medical Officer that doctors feel themselves and other health professionals feel that they are not able to fulfil their duty of care because of the legislative position in Northern Ireland is a matter of significant concern. It is a matter that as Chief Medical Officer I have significant concerns about.
Could you just repeat who said that to you?
Certainly in the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and made that very, very clear. And I think that's why we made a recommendation to ministers that there was a need to change the law.
If you were asked, so if you as Chief Medical Officer have been told that doctors who obviously have a Hippocratic oath and are a regulated sector are unable to fulfil their duty of care, what is your professional obligation? Setting aside the politics and policy, what is your professional obligation as Chief Medical Officer in terms of your reaction to that?
My professional responsibility is very clear. I have a professional responsibility to advise ministers in relation to the circumstances that doctors find themselves in Northern Ireland, the fact that they do not feel that they can provide an adequate, fulfil their duty of care or provide adequate care to meet the health needs of women with a diagnosis of fatal fetal abnormality who have decided that they cannot continue with that pregnancy. I think that is a very difficult set of circumstances that health professionals are being put in, and I think it's the responsibility of those who legislate in any jurisdiction to ensure that that situation is addressed.
And the working group suggested that you need to have a change to the law,
yes,
not just clearer guidance on how to interpret the law in those cases.
Guidance will not address these issues. What this requires is an examination of the law in Northern Ireland and a change to the law in Northern Ireland if we are to address the circumstances that we can fulfil and meet the needs of women. And in the limited circumstances that I was asked to look at, which was when there was a diagnosis of fatal fetal abnormality, and to allow doctors and other health professionals to fulfil their duty of care.
But in the absence of somebody who is a minister in the Northern Ireland Assembly, that in the absence of that individual for you to advise, who do you now advise? Because your job as Chief Medical Officer doesn't cease because there isn't an assembly. So who does your advice now go to?
Well, obviously, in the absence of ministers, my advice will be provided to respective permanent secretaries in the Department of Health and the Department of Justice. There are limitations in terms of what officials can do in the absence of ministers. The Department of Justice is not, as we've heard from Amanda earlier, in a position where it can act on that advice to take forward and take forward proposed amendments to legislation. There is no mechanism to do so in the absence of ministers.
Sorry to interrupt here again, Vicky, but if a doctor's unable to fulfil their duty of care, and we've been hearing examples where, in my untrained view, you're putting people's lives at risk. What happens then? Because we can't ignore. I mean, if it was in another area, say, for instance, cardiac operations were being done in such a way as it was it was killing people, what would you do then?
Well, we have to be clear on this, that where there is a risk of life to the life of a woman, that is covered within the extant legislation in Northern Ireland. So health professionals can act in those circumstances. The guidance is very, very clear. If there is a risk to the life of a woman, that takes priority over any other consideration. So doctors and other health professionals have an obligation and a duty of care to act in the best interest of women in that circumstances. Or indeed, if there's a risk a serious risk of adverse impact on physical or mental health, and that risk is likely to be long-term or serious. So where there's a risk to life, there is no impediment to acting. The difficult situation that we find ourselves in is that when women with a diagnosis of fetal abnormality feel unable to continue with that pregnancy, and in that very difficult set of circumstances, there are a range of potential obstetric complications and other complications which not only impact on the risk for that woman in that pregnancy, but potentially on other pregnancies as well. Within the extant legislation in Northern Ireland, it is not possible for health professionals to act to seek to terminate that pregnancy if that is the conclusion of the assessment of what's in the best interests, in the medical best interests of that woman, and indeed that has been an informed choice that she has made. In those circumstances, I do not have any power to act other than to make very strong representation to respective ministers, which we did back in October 2016. We were unequivocal in terms of action that we felt that needed to be taken at that time. Unfortunately, the executive has fallen, and that has been unable to progress it since that time.
Thank you.
Do you think that women and girls who are seeking an abortion are receiving adequate support and advice by medical professionals? And especially, do you think there's adequate support and advice and care for women and girls who are pregnant as a result of rape, incest, or carrying a baby who's been diagnosed with a fatal fetal abnormality?
I think, again, that was a matter which we covered in our working group report, and the simple answer to that is no. The report made a number of recommendations in terms of how we could improve that. During the course of that work, our colleagues in the Public Health Agency, in Northern Ireland equivalent to Public Health England, met with a number of women who had found themselves in this situation and their partners. I met with, similarly, a number of women, and it was quite clear that the provision of information, the support, both emotional, psychological, both when the diagnosis was made and in relation to the aftercare, should that woman determine to proceed with the termination of pregnancy out with this jurisdiction, needed to improve. And there are proposals which we developed to improve those aspects of the care that were provided.
And who do you think should provide that? Who should fill that gap?
There are aspects of it which, again, we have sought advice as to whether or not we can progress. I mean, obviously, a lot of this, I think that there have been, I suppose, a constantly changing set of circumstances. We produced a report and recommendations to ministers. We had draft leaflets and information for women in this circumstance. There then was the working group, which was to consider recommendations of whether the law should change. That made recommendations that the law should change. The information, etc., was not produced at that time because, again, there was a clear recommendations to ministers for a change in the law. And subsequently now we have the situation whereby we have provision of service in other jurisdictions, and we have sought legal advice as to whether or not we can include reference to that in relation to any information that we provide. And the advice on that is not straightforward. And we still wait definitive legal advice on whether that's possible.
Okay.
This is an extremely complex situation with no, we cannot, certainly within health, we cannot fix with guidance and information leaflets. This requires an examination of the law in Northern Ireland and a consideration of whether the law in Northern Ireland needs to change.
What we have heard, though, if I may, Chair, just drill down in this, is very patchy differences. So we've heard evidence from a woman who's been diagnosed with a severe FFA for her child, being told at one hospital, we can help you, and then going to another hospital, no, we can't help you. So there's patchiness.
Inconsistency is the word I would use.
It's a better phrase.
Yes, and I heard that too. And as I say, in the guidance which we published in March 2016 made very clear our expectations of the health and social care sector and the trusts in that regard. The Public Health Agency has developed proposals in terms of how we might better coordinate that care. We have no steer and had no steer from ministers because, again, the executive collapsed and there were clear recommendations within Section 5 of the FFA working group as to whether ministers were minded to support that. That was a priority, and that it should be funded to provide the level of care that one would reasonably expect, and to reduce those very fundamental issues about variability in the levels of advice and support provided.
Can I just drill down that to another level as well? I mean, you actually have a combined role of Chief Medical Officer and Chief Executive of the Belfast Health and Social Services Trust. And one of the issues that we have heard about is that correct?
No, it's not. Thankfully, not for some years. My period of double jobbing.
Oh, I'm sorry. It might say
my period of double jobbing, I think, came to an end in February 2016.
Oh, okay, right.
From recollection.
But you still have that experience. What we've heard about is inconsistency, particularly in terms of the legal advice that's provided. Well, no, there's a. What it has been put to us is that there could well be inconsistency in terms of the legal advice that has been given to different trusts with regards to the lawfulness or not of conducting certain activities, information giving relating to abortion. If that were the case, do you think that would be the case? And if it were, how would you, as Chief Medical Officer, advise trusts so you don't have an inconsistency in the interpretation of the law? Because I think that would fall squarely into your job.
I'm not certain that it necessarily would. Certainly have not heard that issue around inconsistency in legal advice being raised. It's certainly not.
It's been raised with us at least 3 times.
It's certainly not been raised with myself, and certainly in none of the investigations or in any of our work was it raised. I suppose really as Chief Medical Officer, I need to confine my comments into relation to matters which I'm competent to advise you on. In terms of legal matters and legal considerations, that would really be out with my remit. I mean, certainly in the guidance, again, it makes clear on our expectations of the arrangements that trusts have in place to support health professionals in these difficult circumstances, in terms of a system of accountability to ensure that terminations of pregnancy are carried out within the law in Northern Ireland, a monitoring system which we do in terms of ascertaining the numbers of pregnancies that are termination of pregnancy are carried out and the reasons why. And obviously the guidance also makes clear the advice and support that should be available to health professionals, including legal advice.
So Alistair, if it's not Dr McBride's job to ensure consistency in the application of the law, whose job is it?
I mean, it's not Dr McBride's job to give advice on the law.
No, in the application of the law, not the law. It's important that you understand. It's not the law itself, it's the application of the law so that we have consistent clinical standards.
The law is not crystal clear. It goes back to 1861. So anything we do is an interpretation of that and then following from judgments that have been made in courts. The point of the guidance was that the emphasis was placed on a doctor with a woman in front of them, and they made a decision based on the clinical circumstances of the woman. So we in the department can't second guess what the doctor saw or what advice he sought.
But if inconsistencies have been found, who do they get reported to, and how do you resolve those inconsistencies? Because it happens all over, doesn't it? I mean, there are inconsistencies in every part of the United Kingdom, and then they'll be looked at and that'll be resolved, because we don't want an inconsistent health service.
Well, I mean, again, maybe Amanda might be able to provide some steer on this, but ultimately the law is the law.
I'm talking about inconsistencies. I'm not talking about the law.
The interpretation of law is ultimately, I suppose, a matter for the courts in terms of how it is applied. I know that you're talking at a different level in terms of advice to trusts in relation to the law. The guidance that we produced in March 2016 was very clear in relation to the law in Northern Ireland and attempted to provide a framework for your point, Jess, in relation to clinical framework for decision making within the law in Northern Ireland. over and above that, as I say, I'm not aware of any significant gaps in that guidance and that would require legal interpretation, unless, of course, there was emergent case law as a result of court cases in terms of the interpretation.
So, Amanda, do you recognise what I'm talking about in terms of different trusts taking legal advice on the lawfulness of advising people around abortions, and that differs trust by trust, or do you think that's not correct?
No, I was just trying to find out exactly what sort of advice are we talking about, and what sort of inconsistencies. Is this inconsistencies surrounding whether a trust or whether a person accesses a termination of pregnancy,
whether or not a medical professional
advice?
can undertake a termination? I mean that there seems to be some trusts which are more likely than others
to be brave and have legally less risk-averse advice.
Well, that's an interpretation by separate trusts of the guidance that's already been published by the department. Yes,
presumably.
Is that something, Amanda, that as a civil servant you would be keen to be aware of, and that you would be able to then look at? Because this is the application of the law. It's not about changing the law. It's whether or not trusts are being correct in their interpretation of the law.
Well, I'd have to give you back to colleagues.
There isn't a formal system of assurance and accountability that comes through to the department from the trusts. And it has not been raised as an issue.
Yeah.
So it's not, if it was raised as an issue, would you then look at it?
Look at it.
As civil servants, you wouldn't need a minister to look at that, would you?
But I mean, raise it themselves.
But if the trust thought there was a problem, they absolutely should raise it.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I'm struggling to try to get my head around the specifics. But again, we have a central business service organisation which provides legal advice to all of the trusts. So I'm struggling to understand why there may be inconsistency in the legal advice.
So are we, Michael, because we know that it's been explained to us.
What we're being told, and go back to the testimony we've heard from some women that we've heard it in the one hospital. Yeah. Senior consultant is saying, we could help you with this. Mm-hmm. And this is the case of a child who the baby was going to die. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in another hospital, the senior consultant is saying, no, never possible. Here. So why do we have this inconsistency, whether that's the legal advice or the different approach by the ethics committee or different individuals? Do the numbers hold out? Are that, when you look at the dozen cases last year, are they happening more in one trust than in other trusts? Are they spread around? Or is it just not clear?
I don't know the answer to that in terms of, certainly we can get that information for you. But
there's only 12.
Yeah, yes. I think we also need to bear in mind that there are some trusts which would provide regional services and would deal with more complex pregnancies, and therefore that might slightly skew those figures. I think what you're describing there, to my mind, doesn't sound like a disparity in legal advice, but actually a difference in clinical judgment in terms of the application of the extant legislation. So whether or not the grounds are met that the impact on a woman's physical or mental health is serious and real and likely to be long-term and permanent. It strikes me that it's an interpretation of that.
So I'd just like, maybe we can send you to go away home and think about it if we could. We've been told in some cases that it's suggested that it's different legal advice being given as well as different clinical.
As the chief medical officer, there is a woman there, and it happens all the time. We get given different doctors' opinions. There is a woman there who is being told clinically a different diagnosis about how carrying for a further 15 unnecessary weeks a baby that will certainly die, what that will do to that woman. Yep. Clinically speaking, as the chief medical officer, I'm not asking you to pass your opinion on that particular case, but are you not concerned that the perception of the guidance is causing bad clinical decisions.
Very different.
Yeah, but
different
and
I think it's a more fundamental issue. It isn't the guidance; it's the law. The guidance is based on the law in Northern Ireland. No amount of guidance can change the law.
It's not an issue about the guidance. As the Chief Medical Officer, do you have grave concerns about the different levels that are being caused because of concerns about the chilling effect, etc.? What effect that is having on clinical decisions being made?
I mean, I've already expressed my concerns in relation to the law in Northern Ireland, and as a result of the work that we undertook as part of the FFA working group, our recommendation to then ministers that the law change. Clearly, that remains my view. I think there is a reasonable expectation in any jurisdiction that health professionals should be able to act in the medical best interests of patients, and that they should do so without fear of acting out with the law. It is clear from the work that we did that the current situation and the current law in Northern Ireland does not and causes health professionals have fundamental concerns about their ability to fulfil their duty of care, and they have a concern that the current law, and it's in the report itself, places an undue burden on the health and well-being of women in Northern Ireland.
Just before we move on to the next question, I think Angela just got a supplementary on that.
No, I suppose the thing that we are hearing repeatedly is that because of the chilling effect of guidance, and I think you've expressed concerns that practitioners have come to you as the Chief Medical Officer expressing concerns about their ability to act, but because of that, women are basically saying that as well as the healthcare system already having a postcode lottery, they feel that there's even more of an inconsistency between one healthcare trust and the next. What recommendation would you make to whoever you believe should be held accountable at this present moment in time to improve that?
Well, I think there will always. And the guidance also makes this clear that every individual case needs to be judged as an individual case. I mean, we resisted, I think correctly, at the trying to put an exhaustive list of those circumstances where a termination of pregnancy would be lawful. The purpose of the guidance was to ensure that women in Northern Ireland could avail of a termination of pregnancy where it was lawful to do so. We can't, through the guidance, change the law, but where there is inconsistency in the interpretation of that or the application of that is a matter and cause for concern. I think that confidence, because I think it is about confidence in healthcare professionals, is only likely to be addressed when they feel there is absolute clarity in relation to the law in a range of very complex set of circumstances. Their feeling is that there is not that clarity, as Alistair has said, in relation to the 1861 Act or the 1945 Criminal Justice Act, or indeed as those have subsequently been interpreted. But the other point I would make, and I think this is an important point, the guidance also makes clear that whilst there is no statutory or legislative requirement, that where a woman is dissatisfied with or requests a second opinion, that every effort should be made to facilitate that second opinion, because as Jess has already said, there may be different interpretation of those clinical circumstances.
Can I just say, from the testimonials we've heard, I don't think it's been clear to any one of those women who come to us and given testimony, especially on FFA cases, that they could have asked for a second opinion. That they could have asked for a second opinion.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's at all clear in whatever the processes or pathways or support. That
it's
ability.
Not clear, sorry.
It's not clear.
Not clear.
It's definitely not clear.
It's very clear in the guidance, and
it may be very clear in the guidance, but I mean, we've even heard from a woman who experienced this less than 6 months ago,
right,
and was crying out for second opinions. And had been given one opinion at one hospital and then another opinion at her local hospital, and then couldn't get back to the other one. So that, just again, if you could take that away from me. Sure. We've also received evidence that women and girls who are seeking abortion are sometimes not being given with information about funding the treatment in England. Do you think there's a gap in that advice of how to find that pathway to England, and if there is a gap, who should fill it?
Well, again, I think it's section 511, section 514 within the draft guidance does make very, very clear that there is no impediment at all for health professionals to advise of services which are available in another jurisdiction, but which would be unlawful in this jurisdiction. Absolutely none. You know, and I use the word, and I hope it's not misinterpreted, but for health, there is nothing to prevent a health professional signposting or making a woman aware of services that are available in other jurisdictions should she determine that a termination of pregnancy is the right course for her in a pregnancy given a particular set of circumstances. It's crystal clear in the guidance. It couldn't be clearer. However, what has never been tested in the courts in Northern Ireland, whether it would be lawful to advocate or promote, i.e. to refer a woman into services in another jurisdiction where they are lawful, where it is unlawful for those services to be provided within Northern Ireland. That has never been tested.
Is it clear that it's not unlawful to signpost someone to the family planning FPA?
The guidance is very clear. There is absolutely no impediment. You know, the guidance made this crystal clear in March 2016, and I'm surprised that there are still any concerns in that respect.
What have you done to, given that we have heard overwhelming confusion, what could you do as a civil servant to make sure that confusion doesn't persist?
I mean, I'm very happy to take that away and consider that. But this is a matter. This has been a matter which has been since 2001, 2004. This has been to the fore of public and wider societal debate in Northern Ireland. It has been to the forefront of interaction with health professionals in Northern. My interactions with health professionals, the chief nursing officer's interaction with health professionals and respective royal colleges. So I struggle to understand why there would be a gap in individual professionals' awareness of...
But if there is a gap, Dr. McBride, do you think you'd be able to fill that gap, wouldn't you?
The other thing I would add, and this is an important point, I, as a doctor, have a professional duty to ensure that I'm aware of relevant guidance, up-to-date evidence of best practice, so I can assure myself of my competency and my ability to deliver the best possible care I can for my patient. So there is responsibility in all health professionals, not just on the department, but on health professionals to assure that they familiarise themselves with appropriate guidance so that they are best placed to provide the best support.
You're neatly taking us on to Tonia's question.
Sorry.
And thanks for that, because you're saying about there being crystal clear guidance in 2016 and that it's your duty as a doctor. But who is regulating and whose responsibility is it to regulate these healthcare professionals in ensuring that they have given the correct advice and the treatment about abortion, including the advice on travelling to other parts of the UK and Ireland?
Well, like every part of the United Kingdom, health professionals are regulated by their professional regulator, whether that's the General Medical Council or the Nursing and Midwifery Council. As a doctor, I know you are talking to the General Medical Council later this afternoon. Good medical practice, which is guides me in terms of my responsibilities as a doctor to ensure that at all times act in the best interests of my patient. And to act in the best interests of my patient requires me to ensure that I keep my skills and knowledge up to date, and that includes in familiarising myself with extant guidance and evidence-based practice.
So it would be up to the individual then to refer the doctor, the medical professional, to the GMC?
That's a different sort of angle on that. So I think if there were fundamental concerns in relation to the professional practice of an individual health professional, then the public does and can refer any health professional to their professional regulator.
So if an individual went along to their doctor and asked for advice on abortion and was told that that wasn't legal in Northern Ireland, and the particular case was the individual felt that the pregnancy was going to cause them lasting psychological damage, would that doctor be acting within their own professional regulatory conduct or not?
Well, I think, again, it's very difficult in the information you provided as to what you mean by psychological damage, because the legislation doesn't refer to psychological
But would you expect that individual doctor to give information to that patient?
Absolutely, and the guidance is clear that in terms of not only the accuracy of the information that's provided, but that information needs to be provided in a timely manner.
And if it's not, then that would be potentially a professional problem.
It certainly would be. And if a doctor has a conscientious objection, again, something which is covered within the guidance, as a doctor, if I have a conscientious objection, I have a professional duty, and the good medical practice and GMC guidance is very clear on this. I have a responsibility to say to that patient, I have a conscientious objection in relation to abortion, termination of pregnancy, but I also have a professional duty to you to ensure that I refer you and facilitate and support you in taking advice from another health professional.
And if you don't do that, that would be potentially a breach of your professional ethics standards.
It would, and it would be certainly a case of my not putting the best interests of the patient first.
How many cases of that sort of reporting do you have in Northern Ireland on an annual basis?
I'm certainly not aware of any, certainly none that have been brought to my attention. But then again, if there were matters that were brought to the attention of the General Medical Council, we would not necessarily be advised unless there were substantive issues that were determined, or there was some restriction in practice, or other action deemed appropriate by the GMC.
Sticking with regulatory standards for a moment, we're talking about the inconsistencies between hospital trusts, that the evidence that's been brought to us. If that were to happen in England, the CQC would look at that because they have a duty to ensure a good standard of care in all hospital trusts. I understand in Northern Ireland it's the RQIA who look at these sorts of regulatory issues. Is that correct?
Yes, other than the legislation and the rules are responsible.
No, I'm talking about the consistent application of the current law. So are you aware that the RQIA are looking at the inconsistencies between hospital trusts in terms of abortion? I was
trying to say there's an important point here, which is the fact that the legislation in relation to the 2003 legislation and the regulations which established the Regulation Quality Improvement Authority differ from the legislation in England and differ indeed from the legislation in Scotland. So RQI does not regulate health and social care trusts in Northern Ireland.
So what do they do?
They regulate independent sector providers under the independent sector regulations, and they inspect under the broad umbrella of clinical social shared governance in a series of themed and specific
So who makes
reviews.
sure that trusts are actually doing what they should do with taxpayers' money?
We as a department, trusts in Northern Ireland are arm's length body of the department.
So shouldn't the department therefore be looking at whether or not their trusts are using taxpayer
and the accountability, I was going on to say, the accountability line is to the department, and as the guidance makes very clear, there are specific expectations of trusts in this regard in terms of the equity of service provision. Trusts have a statutory duty to inquire of the population that they serve and to ensure that the services they provide meet the needs of that population, to ensure that those services under their duty of quality are consistent, and that those services are provided within the law.
So if you're brought evidence that there's inconsistencies, how many times do you do investigations of these sorts of inconsistencies on an annual basis? Because it won't just be in the case of abortion. I mean, CQC will look at my local hospital on a regular basis to make sure it's doing things right in A&E and maternity care and all sorts of cases. Do you do that sort of systematic review?
We'd have a process of systematic reviews which RQA undertake, but they are not...
No, you as a department?
We as a department, no. We, for instance, would have a series of inspectorial procedures within trusts on a range of unannounced and announced inspections within trusts, for instance, around issues around health care associated infections and a range of other matters. Certainly, we would hold trusts to account in relation to their performance on a range of issues.
Given that you've expressed your very deep concern about the situation with regards to abortion and the law, and that you've heard that we've been given quite a lot of concerns about a lack of consistency in the application of the law between different trusts, is this something that you think you should be looking at as a department to make sure that taxpayers' money is being used in a consistent way?
I mean, again, if there were specific examples that you wish to provide, then certainly we can look at that. But as I say, in terms of this issue, which I think this conversation and discussion stemmed from, those inconsistencies are not inconsistencies that have been drawn to the immediate attention of the department. If indeed those inconsistencies or interpretation differences were drawn to our attention, then we'd consider the most appropriate action to take.
Okay, well, we will certainly write with you on that. Just before we go on to our last question, can I ask another question, which is with regards to pathways? Because throughout our conversations in recent weeks around this, we have heard a lot of discussion about the importance of supporting women who may be either choosing to have continue with a pregnancy or being forced to consider a termination of a pregnancy. And there's been quite a lot of concern around, whether or not those pathways for those individual women is very clear. Is this something that you have some sympathy with, that there might be some work to do to make those pathways clearer?
Yeah, and again, I'm conscious I'm sort of hogging all the discussion here, but yes, and we made very clear in our the recommendations to ministers from the FAA working group that we felt that there was improvements that could be made, particularly in relation to those women with the diagnosis of fetal abnormality who decided to continue with their pregnancy. But we were very clear that, and the advice that we had from those who informed the work of the working group, that those were only modest improvements and could not address the very fundamental issues in women who had determined that the course of action that they wished to pursue was a termination of that pregnancy. For me, modest improvements would be at least an improvement. So what is stopping you as a civil servant in implementing pathway improvements, given that wouldn't require legislative consent in any way? What's stopping that happening? Well, I mean, I think that there are, a significant number of priority areas within health and social care, and there are, across the piece, significant resource constraints.
So it's resource constraints that would stop you from doing that?
That would be one factor, and there are also a number of issues which are undoubtedly within the advice and support that we would wish to provide remain matters of contention, I would suggest.
But those that aren't contentious.
And we do not have, in some of those, we as yet do not have a clear and did not have a clear steer from then ministers or from the then executive.
But pathways aren't things ministers get involved in. Having been a minister, you would never get involved in something operational like that. This is very much what civil servants advise you on.
It is, but as I say, this matter in Northern Ireland has very strongly polarised views and very strongly held views, and I think that it is very likely that efforts which would be reasonably made to seek to take what would seem reasonable steps to improve care and support may in themselves become extremely contentious.
Angela?
Amanda, what role, if any, do you think the police and criminal justice system should have in investigating or prosecuting abortion or suspected abortion in the case of stillbirth? Quite a long-winded question.
Yeah. Well, in what respect? What is your...
So in the first sentence, the view is obviously that abortion, if you take one interpretation of the law as a criminal act, then what role do you think the police or the criminal justice system should have in investigating or prosecuting?
I can't give you an answer on what I think the law should have or shouldn't have. No. But at the minute, the current law provides criminal offences around termination of pregnancy.
So would the police or justice act on those?
Sorry?
Would police or justice act on those?
Well, yes. If there's a criminal offence, the police have a duty to investigate. That's basically.
Would they do that in the case of a stillbirth?
Well, I'm not sure that that's the same thing. No. It's not. I mean, there's a criminal offence around abortion, but stillbirth, I'm not sure what that.
No. Sorry, that's just a question I've been...
I think what you might, what you might be referring to there is the requirement in Northern Ireland to refer stillbirth to coroners and for the coroner to consider whether or not there's a need to investigate. Right. And that was a Court of Appeal ruling in 2013. I know that other jurisdictions, if not having moved to that position or considering moving to that position. I think there's no doubt if we look at rates of stillbirth in the United Kingdom compared to other European countries, we have significant improvement still to make, although we are making improvements. So I think that might be caught up in that, but again, it would be at the discretion of the coroner as to whether or not a coroner's investigation would be required in case of stillbirth. I don't know if that's clarifies maybe the basis of the question.
No, that is helpful. Thank you.
It's always important for us as a select committee to know that there are going to be many different points of view, and we are not here just to say one set of views is right and one set of views is wrong. It's to gather those views together. But I think what struck us about this is the level of inconsistency and confusion, which I'm struggling to think of another inquiry we've done where that is so prevalent. And I'll give you two examples. One is obviously women are able to go to Great Britain for an abortion, but there seems to be considerable confusion as to whether or not when they come back they will be lawfully able to ask for aftercare, and indeed if individuals take a medicalised abortion pill, whether or not they would be able to get aftercare in that instance. Why do you think there is such a level of confusion here?
If I'm really honest,
yeah.
Chair, I find that really difficult to understand. We were... again, I keep coming back to it. The March 2016 guidance was very, very clear in terms of our responsibility as a health and social care system to provide, counselling, emotional care, support in relation to at the time of diagnosis, irrespective of what a woman's decision was, that we give that in a way that respects the individual woman's views, that is non-directional, and that we had responsibilities also as a system to provide aftercare. It's very clear that that's a requirement. So I struggle, I'm honest, with that view and perception that sometimes there's somehow or other's uncertainty as to whether that...
And it may be that some people are putting that forward because it assists their case for change. I mean, that may well be what's happening. But your obligations as civil servants is to make sure that the current policy, which does not go away simply because there isn't an assembly, that the current policy is implemented. So what will you be doing to make sure that there is no confusion in communication? I mean, you're not the... our Department of Health in England has to do this all the time to make sure that people are clear about health policies, they communicate. What are you doing to make sure that people aren't confused about the care that they can get in Northern Ireland on abortion?
Well, it was certainly the action that I took back in 2016 was to request that the Public Health Agency and the Health and Social Care Board, our commissioning organisations, undertook a piece of work which was to seek to address those issues that you're referring to in terms of pathways and information, leaflets and resources and support. They did that work in the course of 2016, 2017. And what we then had was the working group established, the potential for the change in the law, the executive falling, and no clarity or certainty about when the executive or ministers would come back. So it has been very difficult in circumstances whereby a matter is high-profile, contentious and cross-cutting for us to progress in the absence of then clear direction from the executive or direction from ministers at the time when they were in office.
But the law hasn't changed, so you have to uphold the law as it is now. Why can't you simply go forward with a communications programme about what the law is now, particularly given the fact it might be doing people harm?
We are actively looking at whether or not the information that has been the circumstances have changed, as you said, with the provision of termination of pregnancy in Scotland, in England, in Wales, and we actively have sought legal advice as to whether that guidance that has been developed and the information support resources that have been developed by the Public Health Agency can be updated to include that. Otherwise, equally, I think we would stand accused of actually putting out incomplete information, and it is not clear in terms of, at this point in time, whether we can lawfully provide that information.
How can you get that to be clearer? How can we help you on making that clearer?
Well, we have asked for legal advice, and we're awaiting legal advice. Just on the clarity point, the guidance that was issued in 2016 we were steered into whether we needed to produce guidance by a judge in 2004. It took us 12 years to get an agreed position that wasn't judicially reviewed. We had many judicial reviews. The guidance is quite explicit on all of the things you have raised. And if you asked about confusion, I would say that one of the areas of confusion is we still hear back that the guidance was issued in 2013 and it wasn't. And the point I made earlier on, guidance makes it clear that abortion is legal in certain circumstances in Northern Ireland, but that is a clinical decision. So different lawyers will advise different things, but it fundamentally comes down to a doctor and their patient.
In my experience, though, lawyers don't really give one point of view, do they? So is seeking legal advice really just kicking it into the long grass?
Well, I mean, we've obviously sought legal advice from the Departmental Solicitor's Office, so it's not just taking a variety and sources of advice. We're taking and seeking resolved legal advice.
And when will you finalise that and be able to tell us what that advice is?
When we receive the advice, I don't have a time frame for that. I think it reflects the complexity of this. I think
it's so complicated.
So, well, as I say, aspects of, and I'm not a lawyer, so I can't advise on the complexity, but it is more complicated than you might think. And the position, as I understand it, I'm not legally qualified, is that it is not, as I said earlier, not been formally tested as to whether or not it is lawful for the system in Northern Ireland at any level to advocate or promote those services which are lawful in another jurisdiction which are unlawful in this jurisdiction, and it has never been tested in court.
Are you worried about that?
Sorry, Vicky was going
just to drill down on a couple of things. The FPA, which is funded in Northern Ireland, have told us that some doctors will refer to them and some won't. Inconsistency. So that would be one area which I'd ask you to look at. We've also been told by BIPAS that of the women who've travelled to England to have abortions, over 95% of them are self-referring. They're not even touching their GP.
They won't be.
And that the women who travel to England are far more likely to end up having a surgical procedure, not a medical procedure, with all the risks that that general anaesthetic surgical procedure brings. It is a far less... They've made the point that this is a far less safe process for women, and therefore health inequality between Northern Ireland and GP and GB. So my question about the advice and support that's given to women is, could you look up why some GPs are referring to FPA and some aren't, and how does one get that information to women to stop them having to turn up in England for late abortions that are more likely to be surgical with all those risks?
Just very quickly, because I know you're short of time, there should be no impediment to any health professional referring into a service which we commission and part fund in Northern Ireland.
Clearly there is.
And we do provide funding to the Family Planning Association in Northern Ireland. In terms of referral to services in England, I come back to the point that at this point in time, it is not clear whether health professionals can formally refer into those services, and indeed whether it would be lawful to do so, or would that be complicit with an act which is unlawful in this jurisdiction but is lawful in other jurisdictions.
That's why people aren't going to their GPs.
And well, that's why GPs are certainly, I can't speak for individual cases, but there is no impediment on health professionals in Northern Ireland providing the advice as to what services are available, or saying there's a telephone number referring to other sources of information, internet or whatever else, but a health professional in Northern Ireland cannot refer to those services.
Yeah. So but you indicated you weren't surprised that women weren't going to their GPs. Why weren't you surprised?
Well, not that not going to their GP, but the referrals, I think you said, are 95% self-referrals, which would be consistent with the fact that GPs are not making those referrals because, again, we haven't provided the advice and can't provide that advice. The second point...
They're even saying they haven't been to their GP first. They haven't got the phone number from the GP. They're just not even touching the GP.
The final point I want to make, because I think this is an important point, is the risk. And this was highlighted in our working group. You're absolutely correct. The RCOG raised very fundamental concerns about the risks to women in the pregnancy because they were presenting later for termination of pregnancy, with the complications, particularly associated with fetal abnormality, with polyhydramnios and a range of other potential obstetric complications, a higher percentage of complex surgical terminations with risk to women and risk in terms of subsequent pregnancies. So there is a compelling clinical consideration here as to whether or not the current situation of law in Northern Ireland is actually having a disproportionate impact on the health and well-being of women in Northern Ireland. That was clearly the resolved view of the RCOG and other health professionals that contribute to this. And the final point I would make is I think there is a legitimate question to be asked as whether it is equitable and proportionate to put in place a disproportionate resource in facilitating the women travelling outside of Northern Ireland to have a termination of pregnancy, separated from their family, friends and support networks, when in actual fact the issue that we are trying to address is a fundamental one of the law as it exists in Northern Ireland pertaining to termination of pregnancy.
Very well made. Jess.
Just very quickly, because you've said that you have said a number of times about it not being tested in the law about whether you can make a referral. There's been no test in that. So
in the courts,
in the courts, yeah. Currently, would you worry about reissuing the guidance, sending out a letter, for example, that said it's very clear that you're allowed to give out advice. It is very clear that you're allowed to, if you're even on a conscious issue, you're allowed to say, I'm sorry, not me, but here's a number for somebody who could help you. When you say that these things have not been tested in the law, do you worry about you being in trouble with the law? Reissuing
Personally,
these things?
No. I think what I have a responsibility as Chief Medical Officer, however, is to women in Northern Ireland and a responsibility to provide advice to health professionals, which ensures that they practice within the law in Northern Ireland and do not expose themselves to risk. I can't duck that responsibility. No. And therefore I need to be confident that, with the advice of colleagues and expert legal advice, that the advice I provided is balanced and measured.
Though you have, and I can thank you hugely for your candour today, but you've said, Dr. McBride, that the current situation on abortion in Northern Ireland risks women's health. You've also said that medics, doctors are, quote, unable to fulfil their duty of care. Do you think this reaches a threshold at a time where you don't have an assembly in Northern Ireland for those that are sitting in Westminster to act?
I was afraid you were going to ask me that.
In your professional opinion, as the Chief Medical Officer here, I find it difficult that you've been so candid with us and you've used words which I didn't expect you to use, like unable to fulfil their duty of care, risks to women's health. And as a medical professional, are you worried that unless somebody who should be filling the void left by the Assembly, unless that individual acts, that actually you're not doing your job properly?
I think that the words I've used are words which are reflected within the FFA working group report. They're there. Those recommendations and that advice was put into the public domain by the permanent secretaries of the Department of Health and Department of Justice because they felt there was a public interest to be met by putting that information into the public domain. I am professionally uncomfortable that advice that we provided to ministers about a clear need to consider fundamental changes to the law in Northern Ireland have not been able to be progressed from October 2016. That is a matter, as Amanda has said and Alistair has said, are out with our control. And in the absence of an executive, in the absence of a legislator, then obviously due consideration needs to be given as to whether that is a tenable situation. Health professionals, again, as just a quote from the report, as everything I've said this afternoon is, felt that the current position was not tenable.
So the current position is not tenable.
Is the view of health professionals.
Is the risk is the view of health professionals? It's a view that has been echoed not only by you but permanent secretaries via.
Well, they've raised concern. Well, they've put the report into the public domain in the public interest on an FOI request. So.
And in the absence of the Assembly, who would be the most appropriate person to act, Dr. McBride?
Well, that is probably not a matter for me to advise upon.
No, sorry. It's a factual thing. I don't know. I mean, is it the Department for Health in England, or is it the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, or is it the? You must know that in the absence. I mean, surely there are other issues that, in the absence of the Assembly, you as a set of civil servants have had to refer to Westminster in the absence of the government here.
Well, Amanda's thinking I maybe speak. Sorry, Amanda, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, there's nowhere else where we can go as the Department of Justice. We have nowhere else to go.
What if women started to die as a result of the policy here? What would you do then?
Maybe if we come on back to that, the only point I was going to.
I'd rather we didn't, because I mean,
no, I won't.
It's pretty serious.
I think that clearly this is a matter which has been previously and actively under consideration by the Parliament in Westminster. You've had there's been a variety of private members' bills which have been proposed in terms of changes and.
Yes, but nobody in Westminster has been saying that doctors are unable to fulfil their duty of care or that there are risks to women's health.
Well, all of that information is in the public domain.
No, sorry, in terms of the situation in England.
Sorry, in the situation in England.
Sorry, I thought that's what you were referring to.
I think that
if you escalated
I would find it difficult to see the circumstances in this particular case where women would die as a consequence of the current law in Northern Ireland. The law is, the guidance is clear, and the law is clear on that where it's a matter of preservation of the life of a woman, then no one should delay or fail to act. In terms of some of the complications that might arise, then I am not aware of situations which have been so serious in terms of those complications that have had an impact of the order that you've described. But again, it comes back to the mechanism by which, in the absence of a legislator, how we would address any recommendation around the need to change the law. We don't have executive, we don't have ministers, and we don't have a legislator. And no matter how we look at this, and indeed looking at even within the confines of the Executive Formation Act and Functions Act, even that and any associated guidance which issues does not seek to make us ministers, and it would be wrong for it to seek to do so.
Of course. And I totally
just check with Amanda. Do you think the Secretary of State has the power to change this law?
Well, I think
Secretary of State for Northern Ireland or Secretary of State for Health?
I think the UK government could. I don't think
that would be legally.
I think there's no. I don't think there's a legal impediment to the UK government acting, but I don't. I mean, I've seen the Northern Ireland office has given you a written submission which sets out their position, so I don't need to say anything more.
I know that we could continue this discussion, and I'm sorry that we've already overrun by a few minutes. I apologise for that. And can I thank you again for giving your time? I know you're busy people. And also for being so very frank. We really, really appreciate that. Thank you very much. We're now having another panel, so if I could ask you to swiftly exit stage left and ask for our second set of panel witnesses to join us, that would be great. Thank you very much, and we'll continue to be broadcasting this.
I haven't read
We are being live streamed, and we're very grateful for you coming in front of us today. Sorry, can we just move that other? No, that's brilliant. Thanks, Karen. The Women and Equality Select Committee is undertaking an inquiry into the UK government's obligations under CEDAW in relation to access to abortion in Northern Ireland. And we're also, frankly, looking to give people of Northern Ireland the opportunity to have their voices heard on this hugely important issue. We're really grateful to you, our panel of medical experts coming in front of us today. And before we start with our questions, could I just do two things? Firstly, remind you that because we're being broadcast, you should be careful about discussing live cases for fear of falling foul of sub judice laws. But also, could I ask you to just say your name and the organisation you represent? Dawn.
Yes, my name's Dawn Purvis, and I'm the former director excuse me, of Mary Stopes in Northern Ireland.
Thank you.
My name is Paul Coulter, and I'm representing the Christian Medical Fellowship.
And I'm Karen Murray, I'm the Northern Ireland Director of the Royal College of Midwives.
And can I just check with our technical experts that you're happy with the volumes? Yes, brilliant, lovely. Angela, over to you.
Hi there. What is your view of healthcare professionals in Northern Ireland on healthcare guidance on abortion? Start with Dawn.
Yes. Well, following on from the last session, I listened very closely to Dr. Michael McBride, and I was quite struck that he is not aware of the inconsistencies in the provision of abortion care for women across Northern Ireland. And the inconsistency not only relates to different health trusts, it relates to different clinicians within the same health trust. So from my own experience, I had women come to me where previously the consultant they'd been under would have provided a termination for them in cases of fetal abnormality, for example. But then when the draft guidance came out in 2013 and did the damage and caused that chilling effect and the fear, that same consultant refused to offer termination of pregnancy post that. I've had women come to me where they've been seen by a consultant who offered them a termination of pregnancy. That consultant went off on holiday and they were seen by a consultant in the same trust who said, "What are you talking about? We don't offer terminations here. Who told you that, and where do you think you would get it?" So there's a real inconsistency across healthcare professionals. And I would say GPs in particular. In terms of obstetrician and gynecologists, it's based on who you know and not what you know. The pathway is not clear. In terms of GPs who have to refer to an obstetrician, if I could describe Northern Ireland when it comes to general practitioners and doctors in general, we're a village. We're that small, and everyone knows everyone else. So there's a fear for women, first of all, approaching their own GP because they're often a family GP, and women are concerned at confidentiality and maybe someone else in the family getting to know. But I've also had women come to me where they've approached their GP to ask for an abortion or to ask for information on abortion, where they've been shown the door, where the GP has said, "It's not legal here, get out." And have come to me in floods of tears to say, and I've said to them, they're not allowed to do that. They have to refer you on to someone else. If they have an objection, conscientious objection, they have to refer you to someone else. They're not allowed to do that. But it doesn't matter.
Okay, thank you. Paul?
Yes, I think our members would again express some of their concerns about clarity of the guidance, but I think when the 2016 guidance that's already been referred to in evidence to you is looked at, it is very clear. My reading of it would be that it's very clear. I think that needs to be consistently applied. It needs to be clear across the board. But our members are also identifying some other concerns to us, and those would include the sense that there could be a better informed consent. So there's a real concern that there isn't good information or clear information about what is actually entailed in procedures and abortion procedures for women who are considering travelling, for example. And there isn't clarity, and I'm aware that there isn't clarity in even some of the language that's available in Great Britain around that. There's also a sense that there could be an improvement in perinatal palliative care, so that there could be an improvement in provision for women who are carrying through with their pregnancy, and in those situations where their child is not expected to live long, and so more privacy, better facilities, better care around that. And then really the biggest concern that our members would have is that if there should be any change in the law, that they would be very concerned about conscience issues. And that's not just for medics. We are a medical association, but we do have members who are nurses and midwives, and I think we would like to see good conscience provisions for all healthcare professionals should the law change, but that's not our preferred position. We don't believe there needs to be a change in the law.
Okay. Karen?
I think one of the difficulties, I know there was quite a lot of discussion in the previous panel that everybody was referring to the 2013 guidelines. I think that's because the 2016 guidelines came out very quietly. I also think that the issues that were raised in the 2013 guidelines created the situation of fear. And whilst the 16 guidelines appear more measured, they haven't actually taken away the key elements. And therefore that fear still exists. And certainly from midwifery members, they are very unsure of how to react when they come in contact with women who may have travelled to England for an abortion, may have presented in a maternity unit with bleeding. They still feel very much that it's difficult to ask questions. So if a woman presents and she's bleeding, they're very uncertain about asking questions because they're uncertain about the answers they're going to get, and then they're uncertain about how they deal with those situations.
That was going to be my next question. Do you think that women and girls in Northern Ireland seeking information about abortion receive adequate information and treatment by medical professionals?
I think the information is not what it should be. I think we could have much stronger information. I do concur with Dr. McBride when he says he mentioned the work that the PHA had carried out in terms of developing leaflets for various scenarios, but those leaflets have never come into the public domain. And I take on board his point about the sort of the difficulties of the topic area, but certainly there is information there. It's ready. With some minor amendments. It's been co-produced with women, and I think it would be helpful if that information was made more readily available. I also pick up the pathways issue that Dr. McBride mentioned, because the issue of clear pathways of care, so a woman who presents requesting a termination of pregnancy hopefully meets a minded professional who will go through the procedures and identify the organisations to put in contact with. There needs to be a pathway where that woman can then access that organisation, have an organised termination of pregnancy in GB, but has a pathway that allows her to return to Northern Ireland with a package of care, and that she doesn't arrive back in Northern Ireland completely unsure of where to go for support. Certainly we would have members who would report situations, and it invariably happens at night time or a Saturday evening, where they have women who present as obstetric emergencies, bleeding, and it is difficult to ascertain what the cause has been, what the pathway of care that woman is on, and they find it difficult then to negotiate the best routes for them to access that continuation of care.
Could I just add to that? I mean, since women have been able to travel to England and Scotland and Wales for free, safe and legal abortion, the Department of Health has failed to issue any guidance or instruction or information for women on how to access that service. And I think, again, it goes back to the draft 2013 guidance that created such a fear, and there was an inclusion at that time that anyone providing, and you heard Dr. McBride saying it hasn't been tested, but it's an issue about providing information and advocating or promoting abortion. There is no legal impediment to providing information. And there was a little sort of tete-a-tete at the time between our Attorney General and our Director of Public Prosecutions. The Attorney General's stamp was all over the draft guidance in 2015. And the Director of Public Prosecutions at the time actually came out and made a statement to say that there is no lawful impediment to providing a woman with abortion, information on abortion that is legal in another country. So there is this grey area around advocacy and promotion in relation to information. But what we're seeing from the Department of Health is they're not even providing information.
If I could add to that, I think it is very important that there is joining up of care, and we know that's a challenge across healthcare provision, and clearly if women are returning from England, they ought to have the proper information that ought to be transferred. I think what we would want to say as healthcare professionals as well is that it is properly informed consent is so important. We believe in a non-paternalistic approach. It is important that people have the full information that they need. So that transfer of information within the system is incredibly important. It's also incredibly important that there is clear information and people know the decisions that they are making. And we would have concerns that that's not the case, and not just here, but elsewhere as well.
Vicky. You've spoken about some of the gaps in the pathway and gaps in the treatment. Both, I think you're turning up Friday night or Saturday morning. That would be somebody coming back from having an abortion, presumably. There are also gaps in the treatment for somebody who's pregnant, for example, with an FFA and seeking advice. And if there are gaps, who should fill them? Whose responsibility is it to make sure they're filled?
I think there's probably two levels to that question. Certainly, as a professional, if somebody is presenting, I would like to think that I would give the best information I could, based on my knowledge and understanding of the situation. So, if a woman has a conversation with a midwife, that midwife should be able to provide appropriate advice and information in terms of where to seek guidance. So whether that's to the FPA, whether it's to BPAS in terms of the free availability in GP, I think there is a professional obligation there to be clear about what advice you can give. And it would be helpful if we had some steer from the department in terms of that advice and sort of information that we can share. And I think really there is something there about making sure that we have well designed, co-produced leaflets, information, an ability to get informed consent that can be used. So I think there's the two things. There is a professional responsibility in being clear about what you can do, and then there's a departmental responsibility in making sure that we're facilitated to have information to our hands that we can actually pass forward.
Thank you.
I think there's a fear amongst many clinicians and healthcare professionals that if they have a bunch of leaflets on their desk from the FPA or a bunch of leaflets on their desk from Mary Stopes or BPAS, that somehow they're breaking the law. Yep. And somehow that they will be judged or reported for having those information leaflets there. Right. And I mean, you've taken evidence where GPs refuse to refer women even to the FPA, and I had similar experience when I was in Mary Stopes and tried to engage with sexual health clinics across Northern Ireland, and they refused to engage, never mind take leaflets, even though we provided an integrated sexual and reproductive health care service. So there's a massive fear there that comes again from this criminalising attitude of the powers that be, and the failure to produce any clear guidance for healthcare professionals, for nurses, doctors, midwives working in this area. And it's really the impact on women is horrendous. And you've met women, you've spoke to women. I worked in a clinic where we seen women coming in from the age of 12, girls at the age of 12 to women the age of 52. You know, a 12-year-old who'd become pregnant as a result of sexual assault. She had to travel, the police travelled with her to a clinic in England to have a termination. We couldn't treat her in Northern Ireland because the law said we couldn't treat her. and the police had to go with her. One had to attend the actual surgical procedure in order to seize what are called the products of conception for evidence, so that they could have them there and then and travel back with them. That's inhumane treatment of a young child who didn't have a passport, had never left the country, and she had to be removed from family, friends and everything else to go through that.
Dr. Coulter, do you recognise this?
Well, I'm not familiar with this particular case. So
No, I'm not a particular case, but this inconsistency of GPs' advice, even as Dr. McBride was saying, that it's very clear that GPs have a professional ethical responsibility to provide this information, but we've been hearing they haven't.
What I'm hearing certainly from our members is yes, that there are concerns about inconsistency with information, the availability of information, and even with the guidelines. I think it would be a good thing that those guidelines are made clear, not made clearer, they're clear in themselves, but made readily available and reminded to folks. But I think what's important is that the information that's there needs to be from the department, not from the various organisations who either are involved in abortion provision outside this jurisdiction or for many other organisations, including our own. So I think it needs to be departmental guidelines or information that is clear, that is impartial, that uses clear and appropriate language. And I certainly would welcome that, and I think practitioners would welcome that.
So just on these guidelines, this is my last question, seem to me to be a few different issues. First of all, not enough knowledge about what the existing guidelines are. Secondly, do we need to have more detail on those guidelines so that doctors feel more, and medical professionals feel more confident in the decisions that they're taking, rather than being risk averse and just saying, I'm not going to give you any advice, I'm going to walk away from this?
I think in terms of the advice, if there was a departmental steer and there was clear information coming out from the department that could be then shared by health professionals, I think that would be useful and that would be very clear.
What sort of information?
I think in terms of the availability, who the key contacts are, and something around the provision of post-abortion care when a woman returns. I think there's something about having clear advice around that. I think that would give health professionals more confidence in terms of sharing that. I do agree with Dawn. In Northern Ireland, this is a difficult topic. It raises lots of issues, and so that those conversations can sometimes be difficult even within teams because of differences in views. And there's something about we need to have those very open conversations around that as well.
If I could just give you an example of the guidance and the impact of the guidance. In 2012-13, there were 51 terminations carried out in NHS establishments in Northern Ireland. Last year there were 12. So there's and I know Dr. McBride and others have said how clear the guidance is in 2016. The damage was done in 2013. And I'm sure you've heard about Sarah Ewart and her case, which was 2013. I'm sorry, I was just going to talk about the publicity around 2013, because Sarah asked for a termination and was told by her doctor she couldn't have one. And that was after the draft guidance had come out. If that had happened previous to that, I'm sure that she would have been treated.
Jess, did you want to come?
I just wanted to quickly come back to what Dr. Coulter was saying with regard to not necessarily wanting the leaflets of Mary Stopes or BPAS. What about the Family Planning Association? Would you and your members carry documents from the family, because they're not associated with performing abortions in other jurisdictions? So would they give them more out freely?
I think if it's something that is going to be required to be carried by all and signposted by all healthcare professionals, then it needs to be something that's produced by the department. And that's what I would say. That contains that can contain information.
The Family Planning Association is funded by the department.
I understand, but I think it's the department that has a responsibility to give clear information, and the associated organisations, the Public Health Agency. And
would your advice to your members B, that you want them to be referring, well, not referring people, but giving out the advice?
Well, I think what any patient needs in any situation, and in a situation like this where there are two lives that are present, there are clear ethical issues, and those issues should not be sidestepped. In other words, it would be paternalistic for me to assume what the patient thinks about that. They should be encouraged to think in wholeness and fullness about,
of course,
about the whole issue.
Of course, paternalism obviously is a big concern of mine as well. But what I'm asking you is the current guidance states, as we heard from, I don't know if you were in the last evidence session,
yes.
But as we heard from, it states that if you have a conscience issue, this is the current guidance, if you have a conscience issue, you express that you have a conscience issue. This has happened to me, so I know that this is the case also in GB. But I'm going to refer you to somebody. Here is a number for somebody you can call. Is that currently the advice that you give to your members to follow?
Well, we don't give advice to our members on what they should follow in that situation. But certainly I think that those guidelines are sound.
They're clear.
I think they're clear and sound.
And just following up on that before Tonya comes in, it's clear from what Dr. McBride said was that GPs have to do that. It's not an option. They have to give that information, and if they're not in a position to give that information, then they are professionally bound to refer to somebody else. What view does the General Medical Council take of GPs that don't do that?
Sorry, the Christian Medical Fellowship, I beg your pardon, you're asking me or
yeah, well, no,
the
sort
GMC?
No, I'm asking you as a doctor.
Yes.
What view does the General Medical Council take of if doctors don't do that?
I couldn't comment directly on that. I can't speak either for the GMC. I can't speak
as a practicing doctor in Northern Ireland.
I'm not currently practicing myself, but I represent an organisation of
right.
doctors who are. But the issue there, I think every consultation with a doctor, between a patient and a doctor, there is a relationship and there's a context of trust. And so patients will often ask complex questions. They'll be expressing various views, emotions, and I think it's very difficult to legislate about every detail of a conversation that will happen in that context. But I certainly understand the guidance, and I don't think our members would have an issue with that patients have a right to a second opinion. They have a right to go to somebody who can give them the advice and the information.
So you recognise that as
I recognise that, and our members would recognise that. Yeah.
Tonya?
Thank you, Chair. Just going on to the relation, the advice and the treatment about abortion, including advice on travel to other parts of the UK and Ireland, and we've talked about pathways and information that is given. But who regulates the healthcare professionals to ensure that this advice is being given? Should it be the Department for Health, or is anybody currently regulating it?
I think all, certainly from the perspective of nurses and midwives, the professional regulation comes from the Nurses and Midwives Council and the code. And the code is very clear in terms of how we interact with women in the case of midwives. The advice that we should be given, the fact that it should be impartial, and the fact that that we should be respecting a woman's perspective and a woman's choices. So I think that from that perspective, the Nurse and Midwifery Council is the key person who would regulate.
I think Dr. McBride had addressed this in part earlier. So from a medical perspective, clearly the General Medical Council regulates. But in terms of the actions of trusts and of healthcare generally, the RQIA also looks at the standard of care. But in Northern Ireland, at least, there is also an arm's length body, the Patient and Client Council, which is there to help and support any patient or client of health and social care to help guide them. So there's a complaints procedure, obviously. That organisation can help them with that. It can also help them to access information. I think it's good that that's available, and that would be another avenue for people.
It's not regulated. It's not regulated by any professional body. It's left to individuals to do it if they feel like it. And that's the stark reality of the situation.
Thank you, Dawn. So the working group report recommended a change in the law for FFA, and that's 2 years old now. So what needs to happen now for those recommendations that came from the group to be implemented? I'll go back to Karen.
you're going to ask me that question. I think for all of us, what we would prefer is a Northern Ireland Assembly and an executive in place with ministers who would listen to the debate, read the report and understand what those recommendations were and act on them. I think the difficulty is that that's not in place, and I think you had quite a long discussion about this in the previous session. When there's no assembly, I think this situation has gone on for such a long time that really we're getting to a point that something needs to be done by somebody, and whether that is escalated up through a Secretary of State or on through to Westminster, it is outside my role as a health professional, but as an individual, I think there is something about that. We're at a point that there needs to be action taken. We need to move the situation forward, and we're not looking as if we may have an assembly in the near future.
But Karen and Paul, as medical professionals, albeit Paul, you're not practicing at the moment, are you able to agree with Dr. McBride that at the moment you and the people who do jobs like you are unable to fulfil their duty of care to women? Would you agree with that, Karen?
I think it is made very difficult for us. I think we interact with women on a regular basis who are struggling in very difficult circumstances, who wish to make decisions but find that very difficult to do. It's not possible for every woman to travel. For some women, that's just not going to happen, either financially or because of family commitments, or just the situation they find themselves in. And midwives are left in a position of trying to support these women in a framework that makes it difficult.
Paul, would you agree that your members were unable to fulfil their duty of care?
Well, I have a difficulty with the language around that, in the sense that it doesn't include the duty of care to the second patient in that situation. And even the language that's used today, for example, I think is misleading on that, in the sense both the term fetal abnormality I don't think is the best or term if we're talking about conditions that have a limitation on the child's life. Okay, but that is not the diagnosis of the mother. It was said earlier that a woman has a diagnosis of FFA. It's not the woman's diagnosis,
yes,
it's the diagnosis of the child. And so I think we have a duty of care to both, and that duty of care is to respect and recognise the right to life of the child, and to maximise the dignity of that child. At the same time, to maximise the mother's well-being, and that must entail looking at the risks that are entailed in abortion, as well as the risks to the mother of continuing with the pregnancy, and also her dignity, and then the professional integrity of the professionals as well. So I think it would be a huge change for healthcare professionals to be involved in ending human life rather than in prolonging, preserving and enhancing human life. And that is a massive, that's not something that when I joined the profession, and others when we took our oaths at the beginning of our time, that we were expecting or agreeing to be part of. So it's a very big change at an ethical level. And so those three reasons lead me to the conclusion that I don't think the law should change on this.
So you think you can undertake your duty of care to patients perfectly happily at the moment? I
think the current law in Northern Ireland strikes that balance of the life of both the unborn child and of the mother, and the provision that is there, it's unlike the situation that was there before the referendum in the South, as we've heard already today, that if the mother's life is at a serious and clear risk, then there is provision for a termination of pregnancy, and that's an impossible situation, as every case of FFA is, and there ought to be all of the support and compassion, but I don't believe a change in the law is the best response to that.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, just to pick up on a point you said, you think that people should be told what are the risks, women should be told what the risks of abortion are. What are the risks?
Well, I didn't say that women should be told, although of course informed consent would mean that that should be available to them. But when a healthcare professional is weighing that up. So we gave a written submission, Christian Medical Fellowship, which details those from peer-reviewed published evidence. So it's an increased rate of mental health problems for women who have a prior mental health history, and possibly for others, and a small but real risk of subsequent preterm births, a possible risk, although this is disputed, as regards future risk of breast cancer, but that needs further research, and a small and real risk of physical complications from the abortion procedure itself.
So breast cancer is one of the risks.
That's one that is there are contrary opinions on. So again, it's in the references are in our
so you would want women to be told those risks.
Well, informed consent means that should be available to them. Obviously, a woman in a crisis situation can't necessarily process all of that, but also when the current law is being applied in terms of the mother's health, then all of these things are being taken into account. So the risks to her of both continuing with the pregnancy and of a termination.
What do you think are the risks of a woman travelling after a generalist anaesthetic?
I'm sorry, I can't.
You're not sure? Okay. So you're not sure about that?
Well, I mean, this is not that I'm talking about whether the law should change here currently in Northern Ireland on fetal abnormality. No, I'm not trying to. No, that's okay. But I think the issue of so-called fatal fetal abnormality of life-limiting conditions, I don't think that is solved by a change in the law.
Okay.
Although I recognise
but Dawn brought up one particular case which I'm afraid has stayed with me, which is the idea of a 12-year-old girl being asked to go to travel abroad. Would you think that is a correct application of the current law?
If she's being asked by whom to travel,
sorry,
I wasn't sure.
The 12.
The law here does not provide for her to have an abortion in Northern Ireland, so she had to travel to England.
But this is not. It's not that a healthcare professional was asking her to travel to England to have an abortion. So I don't think that's.
So you don't think that would be a reasonable request?
Well, it's not. That is not an issue for a healthcare professional here, in the sense that they're not advising her to go.
It's an issue for the law here.
It's an issue for the law here as to whether the current situation of the law. I'm not sure, though. Your question, maybe you could.
So can I just to clarify about the organisation that you're here to represent, because it's tricky because you're here to represent an organisation. Sure. I see the word doctor. I do it all the time.
Well, I am a medic. I'm just not currently practicing.
And I constantly ask.
No. I am a qualified doctor. I'm just not currently practicing.
But you're just not practicing. Yeah. So you did qualify. You practiced.
When did you last practice?
But you stopped when?
But I'm here speaking for an organisation that has 6,000.
6,000.
I don't. Sorry, I'm not sure if they're relevant.
Sorry, I just don't know what your own experience is or how.
No, I'm not speaking from personal experience, but I'm speaking for the organisation.
So I because possibly you were added to our report today, so we didn't get a brief on your organisation.
Yeah.
But I know what the Mary Stopes Clinic is. I know what the midwives are. I don't have an understanding of how many doctors in Northern Ireland. You're giving when you last practiced, whether or not your own experience was in this area or in a different area. You're no longer on the GMC register. I don't.
I'm no longer on the GMC register personally. And I don't have experience practicing in obstetrics. But I'm speaking for the Christian Medical Fellowship, which has over 5,000 doctors who are members across the UK, including over 250 in Northern Ireland. And we have another 800 medical students and 400 nurses. So I couldn't answer that figure. I could find out and
that would be helpful.
Writing.
How many of them are involved in?
But I have spoken directly to obstetricians in Northern Ireland about this issue as part of my preparation for today. So
then, in that case, of all of you actually, in all. Maybe less so Dawn, but certainly Karen and Paul. How do you feel about the potential that when one of your members, has been involved in what has been a stillbirth, not necessarily at full term, but preterm potentially. We had cases of stillbirths yesterday at 32 weeks, 33 weeks, about those being scrutinised by security forces, the police. Have you heard of any cases like that, or
we certainly would have had members who have been to coroner's courts on the back of a stillbirth, because the legislation has changed and all stillbirths are now referred to the coroner. The coroner makes a decision as to whether or not they require a review, but we certainly have had midwives who have been through that process. Often because they're more likely to be issues around or questions around the care that was provided, perhaps antenatally or during labour. So none that I'm aware of that have been purely because there's a question over the reason for the
stillbirth,
other than the potential for a carer.
Do you think that the law on abortion in Northern Ireland played any part in any of those cases?
I couldn't say.
Conjecture. Okay.
I couldn't say.
Dawn, you were nodding.
Yes, because I've heard of a number of cases where we can put it like this: people who are opposed to women having choice or having terminations have intervened in maternity hospitals, accusing healthcare professionals of helping women who have taken abortion pills and who have maybe delivered a baby that's been beyond the gestational limit for medical abortion. And yeah, I know of cases where that has happened, sadly.
Okay, and what do you think, Paul, about the role of the criminal justice system investigating or prosecuting it's not abortion, but abortion in the case of suspected stillbirth?
I really don't have any other comment to add, so I suppose it's the professional bodies that would be better positioned on that.
Great. Can I thank you all for being here today? I think we could have gone on all afternoon. It's such an important topic and it's so full of detail, but we're really grateful to you for coming in front of the committee. Dawn, did you want to make a last
I just wanted to add one thing, if I may. I know you focused a lot on the working group of the Department of Health and fetal abnormality and the recommendations of that. Can I just say that even looking at implementing those recommendations do not go far enough. And when you're faced with a woman who really doesn't want to be pregnant and doesn't want to be forced to continue with that pregnancy for whatever reason, and I'm very conscious that at the end of this month and the beginning of next month, when I was in the clinic, we seen many women who we couldn't help because the law here prevented them from having help. And those are women from the Roma community, from the travelling community, from who are in domestic violence situations. One woman who came in with the stamp boot mark on her face where she'd been constantly battered and raped by her abusive partner over the Christmas period. And she couldn't leave. She couldn't leave Northern Ireland to have a termination. And the law here does not help those women.
Understood.
And so what do we say to a woman who doesn't want to be pregnant?
You make the point powerfully.
Thank you.
Could I just comment on that in the sense that there is, I think the opinion poll or polling suggests in the population and also amongst medical professionals there isn't an appetite in Northern Ireland for a change in the law to abortion effectively on and I don't believe it's the answer, even for those very difficult cases, and I understand that. I'm listening to that, and there needs to be a compassionate and supportive response. But a change in the law is not a solution. I'm not saying there is abortion on demand. I'm saying that's not what people want purely at the mother's choice.
Abortion on demand doesn't exist anywhere. Nobody can walk in and slap their hand on a desk and say, I want an abortion now. It doesn't happen.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to imply that it does.
Thank you all very much indeed. And we are now going to close this evidence session. And thank you very much to people who've been in the gallery as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we're going to look very rude because we've got to go and catch flights. Vagaries of flights.